Time now for a collection of bones, disturbing stories from the pen of Elspeth Davie. Tonight's story, Allergy, read by Edith MacArthur.
The new lodger glanced down briefly at the plate which had just been put in front of him and turned towards the window with a faint smile, as though acknowledging that the day was fair enough outside, even if there was something foul within. "I can't take egg, sorry." "Can't take?" Mrs. Ella McLean still kept her thumb on the oozy edge of a heap of scrambled yellow. "No, it's an allergy." "Oh, one of those. That's interesting. But you could take a lightly boiled egg, couldn't you?" "No, it's an allergy to egg." "You mean any egg?" "Any and every egg, Mrs. McLean, in all forms. Egg is poison to me." Harry Veitch did not raise his voice at all, but this time his landlady withdrew the plate rather quickly. She put it on one side and sat down at the other end of the table. "Yes, that is interesting," she said. "I've known the strawberries and the shellfish and the cat's fur, and of course I've heard of the egg, although I've never met it." Veitch said nothing. He broke a piece of toast. "No, I've never met it, though I've met eggs disagreeing. I mean, really disagreeing." Veitch was pressing his lips with a napkin. "Not the same thing," he said. "When I say poison, I mean poison, pains, vomiting, and I wouldn't like to say what else. Violent. Not many people understand just how violent." There was a silence, while Mrs. McLean, with a soft white napkin, gently brushed away the scratchy toast crumbs which lay between them in the centre of the table. "Do you find people sympathetic, then?" she inquired at last. Veitch gave a short laugh. "Mrs. McLean, when, may I ask, have people ever been sympathetic to anything out of the ordinary?" "I suppose that's true." They both turned their heads to look out onto the Edinburgh street, already crowded with people going to work. There was a stiffish breeze. Visitors from the south, like Veitch, used the word gale, and those going eastwards had their teeth bared against it, and their eyes screwed up in a grimace which made them appear very unsympathetic indeed. Mrs. McLean was a widow. She was an amiable woman in her middle years, and lately she had begun to wonder whether sympathy was not her strongest point. In the weeks that followed, Veitch's status changed from lodger to paying guest. From paying guest, by a more subtle transformation shown only in Mrs. McLean's softer expression and tone of voice, to a guest who, in the long run, paid. They talked together in the mornings and evenings. Sometimes they talked about his work, which was in the refrigerating business, but as often as not the conversation veered round to eggs. As a subject, the egg had everything. It was brilliantly self-contained and clean, light but meaty, delicate yet full of complex, far-reaching associations, psychological, sexual, physiological, philosophical. There was almost nothing on earth that did not start off with an egg in some shape or form. And when they had discussed eggs in the abstract, Veitch would tell her about all those persons who had tried their best to poison him, coming after him with their great homemade cakes rich with egg, boggy egg puddings nourishing to the death, or the stiff drifts of meringue-topping custards, yellow as cowslip. "You'd be amazed," he said. "Even persons who profess to love one aren't above mixing in the odd egg, just to test, just to make absolutely certain one isn't trying it on." "Oh, heavens! Oh, no!" cried Mrs. McLean. Love in one hand and poison in the other." By early spring, Mrs. McLean and her lodger were going out together in his car on a Saturday, sometimes to a quiet tea-room on the outskirts of the city, or further out into the country, where they would stretch their legs for a bit before having a leisurely high tea in some small hotel, where, as often as not, Mrs. McLean would inform waitresses and sometimes waiters about Harry Veitch's egg allergy. Then Veitch would sit back and watch the dishes beckoned or waved away, would hear with an impassive face the detailed discussions of what had gone into the make-up of certain pies and rissoles, and would occasionally see Mrs. McLean reject a bare-faced egg outright. He never entered into such discussions. It almost seemed as though he had let her take over the entire poisonous side of his life. Before long, Mrs. McLean had given up eating eggs herself. She wouldn't actually say they disagreed with her nowadays. That would be carrying it too far. But how could what was poison to him be nourishment to her? By early summer, she and her guest had explored the surrounding countryside and every out-of-the-way restaurant in the city. Mrs. McLean gave him a great deal. It was not only his stomach she tended. She gave him bit by bit, but steadily and systematically, the history of Edinburgh as they went about. "You're standing on history," she would exclaim, nudging him off a piece of paving stone. Or, as he stood wedged momentarily in the archway of a close on a wild afternoon, her voice would rise triumphantly above the howlings and whistlings around him. "You're breathing in history. Look at that inscription above your head." By late autumn, Veitch had got his job well in hand. It was expanding, he said, really bursting its bounds. Mrs. McLean knew little about his job, but she identified with it, and she was not one to stand in the way of his work. He was not so available now. He worked late and had little appetite for the original eggless dishes she set before him at supper. Worst of all, when a few days of unexpected Indian summer began, a sudden spate of work took him away from her for longer and longer sessions. He began to be busy on Saturday afternoons, and even on Sundays he found he must use the car to make certain contacts he'd not had time for during the week. Reluctantly, Mrs. McLean decided that until the pressure of work slackened, she would simply take a few bus trips on her own while the weather lasted. She set off, good-naturedly enough, on solitary sprees at the weekends, as often as not ending up with tea alone in some country hotel or seaside cafe where they had been earlier in the year. One Saturday afternoon, she took the bus right out into the country to an old farmhouse where they had been a couple of months ago. It stood well back from the road amongst low, gorse-covered hills, and winding through these were deep paths where you could walk for miles in a wide circle, eventually coming out again near the house. Mrs. McLean decided to take her walk after tea. It was one of the last warm days of the year, so warm that after half an hour or so she had to remove her coat, and a mile further on uphill she was glad to lean on a gate and look down to where, far off, she could just see the line of the crags and Arthur's Seat with the blue haze of the city beneath. Near at hand, the weeds of the fields and ditches were a bright yellow, yet creamed here and there in the hollows with low swathes of ground mist. But something jerked her from her trance. She realized with a shock that she was not the only person enjoying the surroundings. Unseen, yet close to her behind the hedge, there were human rustlings and murmurings. She bent further over the gate and craned her head sideways to look. Seated on a tartan rug, which came from the back of her own drawing-room sofa, was Harry Veitch, his arm round the waist of a young woman whose hair was yellow as egg yolk. Their legs lay together, the toes of their shoes pointed towards one another, and Mrs. McLean noted that under a dusting of seeds and straws, Veitch's shoes still bore the traces of the very shine she had put there the night before. For a few seconds longer she stood, staring. Then, Mrs. McLean suddenly lifted her hands from the top of the gate as though it had been electrically wired, turned swiftly and silently down the way she had come, and made for the bus route back to the city. Sunday breakfast had always been a more prolonged affair than on other days, and the next morning Harry Veitch came downstairs late in green and white striped pyjamas under a maroon dressing-gown. He looked at ease, and on his forehead was a faint glow, which was nothing more nor less than the beginning and end of a Scottish sunburn. For the weather had broken. Mrs. McLean greeted him, seated sideways at the table as usual, to show that she had already eaten. But now Veitch was showing a strange hesitation in lowering himself into his seat. For some moments he seemed to find extraordinary difficulty in removing his gaze from the circumference of the plate before him, as though its rim were magnetic to the eyes, which, try as they might to burst aside, were kept painfully riveted down dead on its centre. But at last, with tremendous effort, he managed to remove them. Casually, smiling, he looked round the room at curtains, pot plant, fire screen, sideboard, greeting them first before he spoke. "Mrs. McLean, I can't take egg, sorry." "Can't take?" There was a cold surprise in her voice. Veitch allowed himself one darting glance at the smooth boiled egg on his plate, and another at the mottled oval of his landlady's face, and again let his eyes roam easily about the room. "No, it's an allergy," he said. Mrs. McLean now got up with the teapot in her hand and poured out a cup for her lodger. "I don't quite catch your meaning, Mr. Veitch," she said, coming round and standing with the spout cocked at his ear as though she would pour the brown brew into his skull. "An allergy, Mrs. McLean," said Veitch, speaking with the distinct enunciation and glassy gaze of one practising his vocabulary in a foreign tongue. "I have an allergy to egg." "Do you mean you want special treatment here, Mr. Veitch?" "Mrs. McLean, I am allergic to egg. Egg is poison to me, deadly poison." Mrs. McLean's face was blank, her voice flat as she answered, "Then why should you stay here, in an egg house?" "An egg house?" The vision of a monstrous 6-compartment egg box had flashed before Veitch's eyes. "Yes, I love eggs," she replied simply. "Eggs are my favourite. I shall order 2 dozen eggs tomorrow. There will be eggs, fresh eggs, for breakfast, for lunch, for supper. Did you know there are ways of drinking eggs? One can even break an egg onto the soup for extra nourishment. I have books crammed with recipes specifically for the egg. There are 1,001 ways—" "Poison!" cried Harry Veitch. "Yes, indeed. If you stay, 1,001 ways," she agreed. And for a start, with the expression of an irate conjurer, she produced a second boiled egg out of a bowl, and nimbly bowled it across the table towards her shrinking lodger.
Edith MacArthur was reading Allergy by Elspeth Davie. The producer was David Jackson Young.
The paint shop was deservedly proud of its reputation as one of the best of its kind in the city, for here it was not simply a matter of selling paints and wallpaper. From morning till night, the three men behind the counter offered a never-ending service of advice to customers, regardless of whether they made a sale or not. They were patient over the perpetual problem of matte, gloss, or eggshell surface, grave and dedicated when consulted about a pattern for the lavatory wall, properly thunderstruck on hearing for the 100th time the tragedy of the kitchen ceiling. It was no wonder the shop was crowded. Nevertheless, there were certain times in the day when they had it to themselves. Then the three of them, Joe Wheeler, Duncan and Jim Peyton, would lean their elbows on the counter and look across to the long black wall of partly demolished houses on the other side of the street. "So are they ever going to pull the rest of it down?" Joe Wheeler would say. "Or are we going to stand here and stare at that until kingdom come?" These back walls, the only remaining part of the buildings, had a special fascination for the three men and had added a special dimension to their day. There they saw ancient patches of striped and flowered wallpaper marked with pale oblongs where the pictures had been, chopped-off shelves lined with worn oilcloth, built-in cupboards whose blue and yellow paint had peeled down to the dead wood. The men in the paint shop knew every scar on the walls opposite, walls so lashed by rain, stripped and scoured by gales, that sometimes it seemed time was running backwards, making these the skeletons and ghosts of all the brand-new houses which week in, week out they heard described by customers. For here in the shop, all talk was of the long-lasting, the indestructible nature of things. Unscratchable surfaces, walls which would endure through lifetimes. It seemed they had to believe that their own house would still stand up even if its inmost fabric was attacked with a hatchet. This afternoon, in the short lull after lunch, the men were behind the counter staring abstractedly across to the other side. This was a city where whole streets of fine old houses had been needlessly torn down, but the half-demolished street had not been one of them. Jim Peyton reminded them of this. "But you'll agree these had to come down," he said. "Would you want the old decayed stuff forever?" "Of course not," said Joe. "No question of it. All I'm asking is, why can't they make a proper job of it when they're at it? Knock the whole thing down at one go. Isn't the city full of these leftovers?" "The human species." Joe shook his head. "Are we a dirty, messy lot, then? I'm beginning to think it. Is there anything worse than the mess human beings can make when they really get down to it? Look at that." They had been looking for months. In front of the wall of houses was a huge area of dust and rubble. Old bricks and blocks of cement, rusty pipes and strips of roofing were scattered around. And into this area had been thrown enough rubbish to fill 1,000 waste bins, peel, newspaper, and sodden carrier bags, tins, rags, strips of carpet and linoleum, milk bottles, whisky bottles, cartons and old vegetables. The chips of broken glass in every size and colour would have filled a cathedral window. "A stupid, messy species," pronounced Joe darkly again. The young couple who now entered the paint shop, however, did not appear to belong to this species. Joe hastened towards them, for beauty lightens the spirit and quickly puts strength back into the legs. They wished to see wallpapers, and he took them to the shelf where a tome heavy as the Doomsday Book lay open, displaying every sort of covering for walls. The girl turned the thick pages slowly, stopping at stripes and certain patterns of leaves. "Be sure it's the right green," warned the man. "Remember the ceiling." "Greens can be difficult," Joe murmured from behind. "Let me take it to the window shelf. You'll maybe get them in a better light." At the word light, The three of them turned and looked through the windows straight across to the long black wall of broken houses. "The odd things that get left behind," exclaimed Joe. "Do you see, there's still coal and ashes in some of those fireplaces?" "I see that," said the young man, peering across. The man now wandered away to look at colour lists, but the girl still stood at the window, looking across every now and then, as if to match the peeling papers of the walls opposite with those pristine ones in the sample book. Yet Joe, watching her, sensed something else. "We see some odd things across there," he said. "Pigeons in the fireplaces, and I've seen myself, though you'll never believe it, an owl on a cupboard shelf." "But I do believe it," said the girl gravely. Joe studied her face again. "Do you know something?" said the girl. "I've actually heard a good deal about those houses, or at any rate one of them. I couldn't say which. One of my mother's aunts lived over there somewhere. Maybe 50 years ago, maybe more. When she was first married, she took in lodgers, short-term lodgers. Well, there were only 2 my mother ever heard her talk about. And they were swans. Swans from Russia." "Swans?" "A couple of ballet dancers from the theatre at the back. It was a company on a 2-week visit, a well-known company. Swan Lake. They danced the whole of Swan Lake." "2 swans from Russia?" Joe gave a thin, long-drawn-out sound through his teeth, as though whistling them back across the ice-blown steppes. "I don't say they came straight from there," said the girl, "but they had Russian names. Their grandparents had been born there." "Anyway, Russian or not, that explains it," said Joe. "Explains what?" Joe smiled to himself, but did not answer. It explained the sudden changes in her expression, as though she'd seen white birds fly over demolished chimneys, or sooty fireplaces sprinkled with snow as soft as swan feathers. "Did she ever see them again?" "My mother says she kept in touch, sent a card now and then to the one who married and had a baby. So that was the end of dancing for her. I never heard." "Ah, well." Joe gently brooded on the loss. "Still, somebody got a swan for a mother." The shop was filling up again. Turning, he was swept into a discussion on sandpaper. Up at the window, the man had joined the young woman, and they were going slowly again, page by page, through the book of wallpapers. From halfway down the room, Joe watched until they'd come to the end of the book and had closed it up. The girl turned, gave him a smile, and shook her head. So there was nothing they wanted. Nothing amongst the flowers, the leaves, the stripes or squares. In a way he was glad. He had pictured something different for her. A wall which was plain and so smooth you might well see, sweeping across as though through an indoor sky, the sharp, black bird shadows. Almost 2 months later, work started again on the wall of houses. First, a vast hoarding went up around the area, and for a few weeks became a gigantic scribbling board, where the neighbourhood painted and chalked up its politics and religion, its messages of love and hate. Posters were stuck here and there. In no time, the red and yellow slogans became stamped the one upon the other, like shouts vying in shrillness. The houses behind stayed silent and almost hidden. Only the empty windows of their top floors and a few broken chimneys could be seen above the hoarding, and for a while it seemed that these chalked boards spoke for the present, while the houses spoke only of the past. Yet even the stuff on the boards did not last. The chalk was washed by rain, and the paint chipped off by penknives. Wind tore the posters. The paper mouths of candidates for election, the vendors of quick salvation, were stripped of half their smile in one night's gale. And one day the final demolishers moved in. All morning a great swinging ball of metal battered the wall of the buildings. From behind the hoarding came a slow, steady rumbling of falling bricks, then the thick sigh of heavy dust subsiding. In places, the more stubborn stone took a fierce barrage of beating before it finally let go. But by midday, it was all down. A huge, powdery cloud hung in the air over that part of the city, making the noon light glow a dusky orange, like that of the setting sun. All during the morning, whenever they had a moment, the men in the paint shop had looked across. One moment they had still seen the skeletal lines of upper windows. When they looked again, even these ghosts had vanished. There was only the dust cloud, slowly rising. Joe had been called away to advise on paint. It was the same old question. "Oh, yes, long-lasting, of course," he reassured. "But not everlasting. I can't promise that, I'm sorry to say. Not for walls or anything else. I've had a bit of wear and tear in my time, and it's starting to show. Bit of the shine gets rubbed away. Your brilliant gloss starts to go. Chips flaking off here and there. It's all the same. Paint, skin, teeth, hair, well, it's got to come sometime, hasn't it?" "They get me worried," said Joe as he returned to the counter. "Those ones that want a signed and dated guarantee of immortality for themselves and their houses. We're not gods." The others agreed they were not gods, and folded their elbows more comfortably along the counter. "In the end of the day, what's left of your house anyway?" said Joe. "Black walls and a heap of rubble. One or two memories might go on, though, might pass down through the years. Happenings in the house, things that came and went." "Naturally," said Duncan, shifting his elbows again. "Things?" said Jim Peyton. "Like what?" "All kinds of things," said Joe. "Coming and going." "Swans. Could be swans." The others, on either side of him, turned their heads to stare. Jim gave a guffaw. "Well, we've had a mixture coming and going in our house over the years. Dogs, cats, canaries, even a hamster, God help it, when the kids were small. But swans? Where do swans come in?" Though Joe was dealing with questions all day long and every day, there were always some, nearer the bone or heart, he was slower or even downright unwilling to answer. Smiling, stubbornly silent, he wandered off again to stare out at the cloud of dust which was now spreading to merge with the smoke from factory chimneys, and with the colder fog from the great sea river further out.
"Years ago," said Sullivan, "I was at a formal gathering of persons who were, for the most part, almost strangers to one another. Some enormous committee had been formed. I've forgotten now what it was all about. There were at least 40 of us, and naturally they were going to subdivide it into smaller and smaller committees, you know, the kind of thing. Anyway, we were all there, teachers, administrators, lecturers, professors, clerics and social workers, representatives from this and that organisation. I remember the catering bit came into it too, for there were glasses and coffee cups on the side, and a few cheese wafers, that kind of thing. As I say, what it was all about I can't remember now. It may have been about making money for something or other. A very good cause, anyway. The thing escapes me." "How can the purpose escape you when you remember the cheese wafers?" said his friend Turner. "It often happens. As I said, it's years ago. Sometimes you only remember odd details. For instance, the main thing, in fact the only thing I particularly remember about this meeting, was the field." "I see," said Turner thoughtfully. A field, was it? I pictured this meeting in the city. It shows how the mind runs in grooves. Why shouldn't it be in the country, after all? Good idea. A picnicking committee. But we were in a city, said Sullivan, and in a large boardroom round a huge polished table. You must know the sort of place. They usually have portraits round the walls, going right back to wigs, and often cups and medals in a glass case donated to people for special services. Even now I can visualize right behind me on the sideboard this huge silver platter with dates on it. Why dates, especially? Were they all Arabs? It was a meeting about North Sea oil, I suppose. I'm talking about dates engraved in the silver, said Sullivan, giving the month and year it was presented or something. Anyway, you said a field interested you, said his friend. Was it a picture of a field? You'd be unlikely to see one from a city window, I suppose, though I know there are places even in the centre of town where you can see green grass, and I'm very thankful to live in a city where that's still possible. Wait a bit, said Sullivan. After the main discussion, the thing began to relax very slightly, if you can call it that. Professionals hate to be seen relaxing in public in case they're thought to be not absolutely on the ball. Being a mixed crowd, it was in fact rather sticky at first. People slowly began to ask one another what their professions, occupations, interests were. Oh, nothing personal, of course, good heavens, no. Women, wives, children, sex, salaries, job expectancy, life expectancy, and all the rest of it were kept strictly in the background. This meeting seemed a most secret society, as these things tend to be. The atmosphere was discreet, very cautious, intensely subdued. Afterwards a silence fell, and our chairman, a kind and charming fellow, leant forward and said courteously to someone at the opposite side of the table, "And your field, Mr. Peterson? Can you tell us something about that?" A natural enough question. Most of us had answered up reasonably and promptly to the field question. You remember the kind of thing. At present I'm working with Dr. Snedden on demography and Roman genetics, but I've been asked to take over a rather broader field on my own in the autumn. Or I remember a rather melancholy and reserved young woman telling us that she was engaged in the study of psychometric techniques applied in tests of intelligence, temperament and personality, and the application of psychological methods to problems of human relations. Of course, there were more direct answers. I remember one formidable woman barking out brusquely, "Waves and vibrations," without batting an eyelid, to be as brusquely echoed by the classical scholar beside her, who proudly uttered the word hexameters, and left it at that. One very young man from theology, looking little more than a schoolboy, promptly gave his field as Christian ethics as relating to marriage and the family, social and industrial life, war and peace. There was a fairly long pause after that. It seemed that this stripling had pretty much hogged the whole field of life for himself. A pause, then, until someone bravely chipped in that he was attempting to redress the balance between something or other on one side and something else on the other. I can't remember what the things were at this distance, I'm afraid. What I do remember was that, as luck would have it, poor fellow, we never heard the outcome of the balancing business because, as he leant back rather sharply to demonstrate it, one whole leg of the chair split under him. It wasn't enough to throw him or even stop him talking. You'll agree, I think, that very little stopped talk in our particular fields, except perhaps a +5 on the Richter scale earthquake. But I will admit it was unsettling, particularly the sudden splintering crack of wood. Such things are supposed to break the ice, I suppose, but I doubt if this chap wanted any ice broken on his behalf, and it wasn't long before he rose to his feet with those familiar words, "My apologies, but another meeting to attend." Well, as I've told you, eventually our chairman leant across the table to this man, Peterson, a solid-looking person with a lined brown face and those keen, very pale blue eyes that are romantically supposed to belong to the seafaring kind, though they're as often to be found amongst city businessmen and just as commonly seen in computer technicians as in bird-watchers. This man, silent up till now, responded enthusiastically to the field question. "I wouldn't say my field has been absolutely successful," he said. "I don't produce a lot from the ground. On the whole, it's a silt soil, but with too much sand and not enough clay to be really fertile. As you know, if the soil feels gritty, it's a sand. If it's sticky and silky, it's a clay. If sticky and gritty, it's sandy silt or sandy clay loam. Loam grittiness mostly means sand, silkiness means silt, and stickiness means clay. But you don't have to take it from me. I'm quoting from a book that happens to mean a lot to me. As a matter of fact, it was clear the others had no intention of taking it from him. Even the mention of a book quotation cut no ice in this company. It was a book they hadn't read, and they didn't want to hear about it. Luckily, Peterson went on, even though the soil isn't all that productive, I've got a fine strip of birch and pinewood on the north side and a good stretch of heath to the south. I shouldn't be surprised if I don't take up beekeeping one day. But, of course, there are lots of ways of being productive. It doesn't necessarily have to be turnips or grapes or whatever. Stars or bees? That was my choice. The company looked dazed. Was he comparing a bee group with a star group? And what was the connection? In our various fields, most of us dealt continually with connections and comparisons. Coincidences, cross-purposes, and catastrophic happenings weren't exactly our line. And talking of lines, some of us preferred to speak about our line of country rather than our field. Somehow it made for a wider and more impressive bit of landscape. Well, I decided it would be stars, Peterson told us. In other words, the fields of the sky. Now, don't imagine that because this was a countryman he was any more modest than the rest of us. Not a bit of it. He too liked the sound of his own voice. He spoke very slowly and deliberately. He made himself heard all right, though I noticed he didn't look directly at anyone but over their heads towards the window. Perhaps it was as well, for there were certain very irritable eyes fixed on him. Some people hadn't yet spoken of their own fields and were willing him to stop talking. All the same, some of the linguistic people, and I count myself among them, had been listening rather carefully to his sand, silt, silky bit. I think, in spite of themselves, they were impressed with the alliteration. Well, stars it was to be, Peterson informed us again. I figured bees and honey could wait to sweeten my old age. So I erected a small telescope in one corner of the field. It was mounted, of course, the main pillar set in concrete. Not only that, but a shed to contain the instrument, and one that could divide clear in two when the viewing was on. I got help with it, of course, and a great deal of time and money went into it, a lot more than setting up beehives in a patch of heather, for instance. Oh, yes, it all took time. But then, what hours and hours of pleasure I've had with it. I remember there was an uneasy stirring amongst our company. Those hours and hours of pleasure made them feel embarrassed. Even our chairman, never anything but kindly and encouraging, flinched slightly at the rapturous tones of the man, as though he were about to describe some outrageously romantic encounter. Half the room sat in disapproving silence, with a nervous tenseness in the rest of us, most of whom didn't know a planet from a star, or a star from the fairy light on top of a Christmas tree. "So I suppose you'll be watching for Halley's Comet coming in one of these nights," said a careers adviser. Personally, I was glad to see Peterson wasn't to be patronised. "Not due for a long time yet," he replied. "I've no intention of sitting out there for a couple of years, and it doesn't whiz past like a firework on Guy Fawkes night, you know." The adviser sat still under the reproof, drawing on her warm gloves, as though ready to sit it out herself through all the winter nights as punishment. "The first thing that strikes you when you look at the sky through a telescope is the sudden increase in the number of stars in the sky," our fieldman told us. "One moment you're walking across the field in the dark, looking up at a few brilliant stars and constellations with patches of black between, or sometimes behind it, all this faint grey seeding of distant stars, almost invisible. But the moment you put your eye to the telescope, you're shot out into the depths of space, so to speak, as though in a rocket. It's an awful moment, hair-raising. Not a thing you ever get used to, even the astronomers will tell you that. Suddenly, the number and brightness of those stars, even the dim grey seeds begin to glitter. Well, I can tell you, some nights I'm almost thankful to be down to earth again and walking back home across the field in the dark." It was difficult, said Sullivan, to say whether the rest of the room were envious or scornful of Peterson's particular field of interest. Besides, it was getting late and rather dim in the room, though none of us thought to put on the lights. We weren't even clear to one another. All our sharp outlines had disappeared in the last half-hour, as though at once dazzled and darkened by the brilliance and blackness of space. We were on our feet, ready to go. The curtains weren't drawn, and one or two flung a nervous glance at the sky as they drifted off. Yes, they drifted back to their fields. For a time I couldn't see their fields. I couldn't see the field of economics. I couldn't see the administrative field. That evening the field of Christian ethics looked decidedly foggy. The waves and vibrations were flat and static as an ironing board. The psychologist was walking back alone and silently into her field of human relationships. Even my own field wasn't absolutely clear, as though there were a low ground mist hanging over it. Peterson went out with us, of course, but he appeared to have a field he could walk very freely in, for he was tramping steadily forward, his boots no doubt gritting on the silty, sandy soil with its small lumps of chalk. It didn't seem so late to us. We were hastening towards familiar cafes where we might find food and drink. But round Peterson's head it appeared to be still black night, for like a hollowed Halloween turnip head with its candle, his brow shone, transparent, as if straight down through the first lights of the city the uncanny stellar radiance had pierced inside his skull. Jenkinson kept the wishbones he found in chickens and other birds hooked up on nails and along various ledges and shelves in the kitchen. They were all sizes and all ages. Some, fringed with withered and stinking brown skin, dated from years back, and looked as though they might have been dug up out of some ancient mass chicken grave. There were others, smooth and yellow as fragments of ivory, and always one or two brand-new ones still stuck with tasty pieces of white flesh. Yet Jenkinson would have it believed there was no particular meaning to his collection. He referred to them as bones, never as wishbones. From the cool way he dealt with unwelcome questions, he might have been an anatomist keeping the secrets of his trade from ignorant minds. Occasionally, someone would try to humour Jenkinson out of his obsession. "Look here, Jenkinson, aren't you ever going to use those wishbones?" "Use?" he'd say. "How do you mean, use?" "Well, I mean, what exactly are you keeping them for? They're wishbones, aren't they? For wishing with." For a moment Jenkinson would look incredulous, then smile slowly, rubbing his chin in contemptuous amusement. He would say nothing. Nothing more would be said about bones of any description. Sometimes Jenkinson would lift up his head and study the round, red faces of his 4 children, his wife, and his wife's mother with amazement. They seemed to him to be without a care in the world. He himself was tall, round-shouldered, and very thin, with long, nervous arms and twitching fingers. His black eyes were set rather closely together in their deep sockets, giving him a suspicious and at times a somewhat miserly appearance. But it was only wishes he was miserly with, wishes which he had hoarded and kept to himself throughout the years. They had piled up more thickly, however, in the shape of bones, from the time when he had begun to leave his business, a thriving hardware shop, more and more in the capable hands of his wife and his married son. A close study of the Jenkinsons' kitchen would have given most people the feeling that this family had eaten nothing but fowls since the time they'd moved in. Yet their eating habits were no different from the average family. They had the usual steaks, stews, fries, and hash, a chicken every fortnight or so, a turkey at Christmas, and for the occasional celebration. But on the chicken days, there was an unmistakable tension at table. Oddly enough, Jenkinson did not carve himself, and never insisted on this. His wife carved, and as she wielded the knife and flicked pieces onto the 7 plates, Jenkinson's eyes would dart suspiciously from dish to dish. If he found the precious bone himself, he would pick it up and put it on one side, but his face would remain expressionless. Occasionally he would look wearily resigned, and even slightly grim, as he handled the object, as though the weight of adding yet another to his pile of unused and yellowing desires was beginning to be more than he could stand. Long ago, when his collection was quite small, and still had a whiteness and a gleam to it, Jenkinson had suffered an immense shock when informed by some killjoy that these bones had no potency unless their snapping was shared by some other person. Up till that time he had kept himself going when all else failed, with a vision of himself on some dark night working his way out from under the stuffy quilt of the double bed, stamped with garlands resembling funeral wreaths, kicking his way silently through the horrible conglomeration of old shoes which seemed to work their way out from under the bed at night like rooting animals of the dark, out into the faintly snoring passage and down the stairs. There, alone in the kitchen over a fragile heap of gleaming bones, he would snap off his wishes one by one with his own bare hands. There was a terrifying, unimpeded bareness about the whole scene, which he had known all along in his heart of hearts was too good to be true. When he was enlightened about his bones, realizing that human beings had caught up with him again and might actually try to take a hand in the business, the zest for collecting became even more fanatical. Only over his dead body would he let those nearest to him snap his bones. For nowadays he could imagine no wish which might come from him, however secretly, which would not automatically be annihilated by its dead opposite flying from his wife. As for his children, they were not the wishing kind. This was how things stood, and how they would likely have gone on, if it had not been for a chance meeting Jenkinson had from his own kitchen with a window cleaner who had been working on the office windows next to their own. The Jenkinsons lived 3 stories up, and a narrow balcony with iron railings joined the 2 windows. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Jenkinson had been standing at the sink staring out, and the window cleaner was squatting on the balcony with a couple of cloths slung over his shoulder, smoking a mid-morning cigarette. He had just got to his feet, and before starting in again had swung himself sideways to take a quick look into the neighbouring window. He was not put off by the morose figure standing inside, but the fine bone drapery around the sink and along the shelves obviously shook him. He pressed his face close to the glass, and steadied himself with his hand on the inside sill of the window, which was open at the bottom. "That little lot there must add up to quite a fair number of fowls, if you don't mind my saying so. Do you never eat anything but chickens around here?" "We eat the same as everyone eats, the normal diet, same as you eat yourself," said Jenkinson threateningly. But he had pushed the window up as far as it would go, and the window cleaner was now sitting on the outside sill with no glass between them. He had taken a cloth from his shoulder and was folding it contemplatively into a square. "Your idea to string 'em all up, then?" he asked. Jenkinson glowered and bunched his shoulders. "Because if it was, you've shown more sense than some," said the other man soothingly. He had now put one leg over the sill. "I mean, why shouldn't you save them all for a rainy day and blow the whole lot together? Get your money's worth out of it. Not that stingy cheese-paring, one here and one there sort of style some people go for. Blow 'em all sky-high. Lord, what a blasted bright, lucky crack-up there's going to be one day." "Crack-up," repeated Jenkinson warily, keeping his eyes fixed on the man's face. "That's right. One after the other. Snap, snap, snap. And the wishes whooshing off like rockets. Boy, what a blast-off!" "It takes 2, said Jenkinson dourly. The other put his head inside and took a good look round the kitchen, listening for sounds from other rooms, then said, lowering his voice, "You're telling me it takes 2. Haven't they got it all arranged now so there's hardly a thing left you can do on your own? It's like that everywhere you turn these days, blocked all along the line." He cocked his thumb sideways. "Isn't she willing to take a snap at 'em?" "I never asked her," said Jenkinson. "How about the family?" "They get what they want," said Jenkinson. "They don't need bones." The window cleaner nodded slowly and brooded for a while. "How about you and me finishing them off?" he said at last. "Finishing them off," repeated Jenkinson, looking round him with dull eyes. He was still thinking of his family. "Sure, we could bust the whole lot at one go. I'm telling you, those wishbones are going to go stale on you if you keep them strung up there much longer." "Wishbones," exclaimed Jenkinson, but the scorn was half-hearted. This outsider was here either to wreck the old order of things or to deliver him forever from his bony shackles. Nevertheless, for a long moment he was silent. Jenkinson said out of the unplumbed, grudging depths within him, "Right. You can come in." "I won't come in, thanks all the same," said the window cleaner, quietly stubbing out his cigarette. A polite formality had established itself between them in the last minutes, as between two persons on the point of a grave decision. This made it easier for Jenkinson, who had begun to gather up the bones from around the place, picking them off their hooks and knobs and putting them into a large pudding basin. The oldest ones made a dry, rustling sound as they were brushed from the high ledges where they had lain for years, but none of them got broken. At last he came over to the window, holding the bowl in both hands. "Is that the lot?" said the window cleaner sharply, leaning in as far as he could go. Jenkinson was unnerved. He walked slowly towards a cupboard, opened it, and plunged his hand down into a pair of old Wellington boots, and brought out 6 more bones, which he took over and dropped reluctantly, one by one, into the bowl. "That's more like it," said the other man. "Are you ready, then?" Jenkinson gave him a look. He'd been ready for years. Long before this young man was born, he'd been ready. Slowly he picked out a bone and held it up. "Not that way!" cried the window cleaner irritably. "Do you want to mess up the whole thing? Like this." He inserted his little finger into the hoop and motioned Jenkinson to take the other side. When the first bone snapped, Jenkinson started as though he had been shot, and at the second, as though some vital part had given way inside him. For a long time he went on twitching, starting and jerking, but when they had got a quarter way through the bowl, he had settled down a bit, except that now and then he winced, and his lips moved slowly as he bent over the dwindling bones. The window cleaner allowed no time to elapse between the snapping. He was in a hurry now, but his face remained impassive as systematically he flung bits of broken bone over his shoulder down into the backyards below. They worked in silence. Jenkinson's wishes were forced from him under fearful concentration, and they hung so heavily over him that the air within the 4 walls of the kitchen seemed to grow every minute more dense. The window cleaner's wishes flew casually from him into the air. They were obviously light things which he forgot as soon as they left his mind. At last the pudding basin was empty. "That's you now," cried the window cleaner gleefully, drawing his foot back over the ledge and crouching on the outside sill. He appeared to be suspended between earth and sky without a care in the world. There was nothing more for him to say. He began to move sideways, still stooping, the cloths flapping from his shoulder, and he was out of sight. Jenkinson never saw him again, and never wished to see him. The window cleaner had done his job thoroughly. He had delivered him from a pile of bones which had been going sour on him, and at the same time killed in him any desire ever to make such a collection again. As for Jenkinson himself, it would have been odd if some sort of change had not showed itself in a man who had got through a great basinful of wishes which had taken him a lifetime to think up. Some people might have expected a little luck to show on him, even if it was simply a fishy shine that would make him faintly visible in the dark. Even those with no superstition in their make-up might have expected him to brace himself in some all-out effort to ensure that at least 1 or 2 of these wishes came true, even if he had to work himself to the bone for it. But nothing of the kind happened. Almost overnight, Jenkinson had given up all idea of luck or anything else. He became a loose, dangling sort of fellow with an aimless gape to the jaw, and a peculiar limpness which extended through all his joints from his flaccid fingers right down into his shambling feet. Family meals were no ordeal now. In fact, the lessening of tension around the house and the complete absence of his former spites and suspicions would have made him an almost amiable chap to be with, if only he could have brought himself to show the slightest spark of interest in anyone or anything. As it was, most people find it almost impossible to make contact with a man who in fact looked and acted as though every single bone in his body, big or little, had been cleanly and systematically snapped in two.
"I feel rather disgusted," said a dark-haired girl in a brilliant green dress, one of a party of 4 having supper in the corner of a narrow, crowded restaurant. "I've nearly finished eating, and now I see there's an eyelash on the edge of my plate." The young man beside her leaned over and examined the plate. "There's a chance, isn't there, that it might be your own," he said. "In fact, more than a chance, by far the most likely thing." "I don't see that," said the girl. "Look where it is, stuck right up in the rim. Must have been there for a long time. Anyway, all lashes are much the same, aren't they?" "Are they? Surely you're wrong. Or why would one person feel the need to put on mascara and not another? There are obviously lighter lashes and darker ones, though dark ones are the ideal, of course. What colour would you say this one was, Olive? If it's very dark, there's a good chance it belongs to you." "Oh, don't speak about it. I tell you I'm disgusted. I don't want to spend the rest of the meal examining it. Of course it must be a cook's eyelash, or perhaps the waiter's." "It's a peculiar thing," said the young man, "that anything belonging to oneself should seem so much less disgusting than anything belonging to somebody else. After all, every eyelash has more or less the same function. Yet if you could prove this was your own, you'd feel relieved at once. You might even rather admire it." The other young man was now leaning across the table, but the girl on his right, a blonde with doleful eyes and sparkling eyelids, leant further back in her chair and looked about the room with a heavy sigh. "Olive is lucky it's only an eyelash," said this young man. "Now, a hair is different. A hair is really disgusting. It can be any length and any colour, straight or curled, animal or human. There's something loathsomely ambiguous about a hair." "I admit the fact that it can come in so many varieties gives it a peculiar unpleasantness," his friend went on. "All the same, what I was saying applies there, too. If she were to find one of her own hairs, it wouldn't appear loathsome in the least. Tell me this now. When you find a strange hair anywhere, do you at once connect it with some imagined person? From one hair, do you see in a flash a complete human being with all the details?" "I see nothing," said the girl in green, though the question had not been addressed to her. "I'm always so disgusted, I see absolutely nothing. My imagination doesn't work at all. I'm paralyzed with disgust." "Oh, please, haven't we finished with hairs and eyelashes on plates? I'm talking about a hair you would find, say, on a cushion in a strange room. Well, there'd be nothing out of the ordinary about finding that, would there?" "All the same, I should never think of actually picking it up," said the girl. The young man turned away impatiently and again addressed himself to his friend on the opposite side. "What I wanted to know was simply if, seeing a certain hair, you immediately thought, let us say, of a girl with straight brown hair. Rather plain, perhaps, rather silent. Or, on the other hand, with a single wavy hair, do you conjure up a fair, curly-haired girl, very gay, very friendly, blue-eyed, perhaps?" The blonde, who had been tipping her chair back at an alarming angle, let it down suddenly and began to giggle. But the young man who had been addressed stared before him with a serious, almost a stern expression. He had taken off his horn-rimmed glasses, and now he laid them on the table between himself and the girl, and watched sharply until she had removed her elbow from their vicinity. "I must admit I haven't got that sort of temperament," he said.
I seldom take these great jumps from one thing to another. When I look at any object, I'm content to contemplate it as it is. If it's a hair, for example, I'd be able to describe exactly what that hair was like, its length and colour, the curve it took in the air. But I would say nothing, never even venture a guess as to the sort of person it belonged to. That wouldn't interest me, I must say. The things that go on behind the scenes in some of these kitchens, the girl in green was muttering. I believe if one could get a look, just a glimpse through one of those swing doors, one would never eat out again, and that goes for even the best of them. Don't worry, said the young man. Never occurred to me that I was taking you to the best. It does happen to be the newest, however. That's the only reason I suggested it. And I know that it's very expensive, too, said the girl. The newest and most expensive, I've no doubt about that. It's just that these things can go on anywhere. Doesn't seem to make any difference how much you pay. What things go on? You mean cooks pulling out their lashes and hairs and throwing them into the soup just for spite? Now, you do admit, don't you, that a falling eyelash is just about the most purely accidental thing that could happen to anyone. Cooks aren't surgeons, after all. They can't wear eye shields, and even their caps don't come down over their ears. They may wield knives, but they're not exactly engaged in an operation. Granted, there should be hygiene, but you can hardly ask for the hygiene of the operating theatre. The girl laughed. I certainly know better than to ask for anything like that. Not after some of the things I've heard. I happen to know that a friend of mine was recently eating the most expensive meal of his life when one of those swing doors swung back a few inches further than it was meant to go, and he caught sight of a chef standing over a cooking pan, picking his teeth with a fork. The young man's expression had changed to one of exaggerated politeness. He sat absolutely still, and it seemed that he was concentrating on giving every scrap of his attention to the experiences of this unknown friend. But the young man with the glasses, who had been leaning forward impatiently during the last few minutes, fixing the couple with an insistent and reproachful stare, now managed to snatch this moment of silence for himself. "I suppose you've put your finger on the difference between us," he said, removing the salt and pepper from their stand and setting them against one another in the middle of the tablecloth. "I can well believe that from one hair, or for that matter anything belonging to a person, you might try to conjure up a complete picture of that person. With me, it's different. It's the thing itself that matters. I could give you a clinically exact description of every detail of the actual thing." "Clinical again," exclaimed the girl. "It seems I'm not to escape the word. When I said picking his teeth with a fork, I didn't mean that he simply put it on one side afterwards, or plunged it into a sink of boiling water. No. When he'd made a good job of his teeth, he simply used it again for stirring the pot, or whatever it was he had on the stove." "Do you often stir things with a fork, then?" asked the young man at her side. He had not let up in his expression of icy concern for her friend. "I suppose you're now trying to tell me that what my friend described was not a correct description of what he saw?" "Not at all. I'm simply asking a question about cooking. Are things often stirred with a fork rather than a spoon?" "Certain things are," replied the girl, with a cool willingness to enlighten. "Things that have to be kept light, I imagine. Some egg dishes, perhaps, or things with a creamy consistency that have to be whipped as well as stirred." The other young man had put back the pepper and salt in the cruet. He had put on his glasses again, and was sitting with folded arms, his face rather flushed. "You two, can't you give it a break?" he said. "What is it now? Recipes! A few minutes ago you were making this terrible fuss over a hair." "It was not a hair," said the girl in green. "If you remember, it was an eyelash. And I made no fuss about it at all, simply remarked on it being there. I'd enjoyed all the rest of the evening, and it simply came as a slight disappointment for some reason." "Disgust was the word you used," said the young man beside her. "And you know, I think the disgust or the disappointment, or whatever it was, came a long, long time before that. Now, I should say the evening disappointed you from the first go-off. Your disappointment, if it wasn't actual disgust, was beginning to show to great advantage when I called for you. You sulked ferociously during the last interval because all the rest of us had enjoyed the play." "Oh, but I say, wait a minute," said the other young man, still flushed but smiling tolerantly. "I doubt if enjoyment is quite how I would describe—" "Peculiarly rude to the taximan," went on the other, ignoring him. "And when we stopped here, you had long ago decided that you were going to hate the place, the food, the decorations, and the people. I believe, in fact, that you had been looking frantically for this eyelash the whole evening, and now at last you've found it, haven't you?" The young man was now fiery-faced. The girl had become rather pale, but all she said was, "Have you finished with your analysis?" "Quite finished." "Then we can go." They both rose at once. There was something acrobatic about this movement, for with one hand the young man removed his chair from under him and swung it lightly back, replacing it again exactly as it had been, only after a slight pause, as though waiting for a certain beat of music, and with the other hand whisked several pound notes from his waistcoat pocket, while the girl managed to leave the table in a half pirouette, balancing on the fingertips of one hand and swinging her jacket off the back of her chair and swirling it across her shoulders with the other arm. Then, with both hands raised and head back, smiling coldly to some distant gallery, she flicked a smooth tail of dark hair from under the collar of her coat. Both wore the detached and utterly absorbed expression of persons engaged in tortuous feats too difficult to explain except to the uninitiated. A waiter who had been standing by the wall now started towards them, shambling a little, as befitting the next performer coming on after a streamlined act. "Hey!" called the other young man who had been left sitting at the table. "What about us? We're not ready yet. Maud here hasn't finished her coffee." But the couple were lifting their hands in extravagant farewell. They were passing tables, the man with his fiery face and the pale girl, from which people glanced up momentarily and flinched, still munching, from the inexplicable wave of heat and ice passing over them. The blonde girl, who had heard her own name spoken for the first time in 2 hours, brightened up a little. She stretched out her hand and placed it on the 2 crumpled napkins lying in the middle of the table, and examined from a distance her silvery lilac fingernails. "Well, what was all that about?" she said, languidly drooping her neck towards the empty chairs. "I have quite simply, absolutely no idea whatsoever," said the young man, still staring over her shoulder at the door. "Because I don't believe in letting one person spoil the whole evening," said the girl, and added, "as she did over that eyelash." The young man made no reply. "Do you suppose he was right?" she went on. "About what?" "About fair girls being gay and friendly." Her own lashes were navy blue and very long. In spite of them, she seemed to be seeing the young man with a deadly and increasing accuracy. "I have, quite simply, absolutely no idea whatsoever," said the young man.